This is Jordan Miller here with a video on how to feed your bees, reasons why we would want to feed our bees, and overall feeding strategies. I hope you enjoy this video and find it very educational. So we come into what do we feed our bees? Here we got a picture of a bacon cheeseburger and french fries. Now this may be something I would want to eat, but if I were to set a plate of this into a hive, the bees would not touch it. So what do we want to feed our bees? But while bees do not eat bacon cheeseburgers, there are a lot of similarities on what they provide versus what bees need to eat. Where we have the bun and the french fries from the potato, those provide carbohydrates. Inside the bacon and the meat, you're going to find protein as well as some oil and lipids. And inside the lettuce and tomato, you're going to gain our vitamins. So while bees cannot eat the bacon cheeseburger, there are other sources to gain these nutrients. So where bees get their carbohydrates is that they will get it from nectar from flowering plants. They can get it from syrup or from candy and fondants. For their protein sources, they gain this from pollen and pollen substitutes. Also from pollen and pollen substitutes, we get oils and lipids, as well as essential vitamins. And bees also do consume quite a bit of water. Nectar is what bees prefer to take and is actually used to make honey. Nectar is defined as coming from floral sources, and it's used as a sweet, sugary substance that attracts the bees to the flowers to engage in pollination. Some of the more common nectar sources that we will find here in central Ohio are going to be maple trees, black locust trees, which also serve as our first major harvestable honey flow, apple and pear trees, and tulip poplar. Popular flowers that provide a lot of nectar are going to be your dandelions and brambles in the spring. And then as we come into summer, we have clover. Sometimes they will hit some neighboring soybean fields. Farmers who plant cover crop or prevent plant acres may use some buckwheat, which provides a black, very dark, strong flavored honey. Then the last flow out of the year will be our goldenrods and asters, and those come in later the fall, and is the last major source prior to heading into the winter. A lot of times, bees are unable to go out and collect any nectar, uh, such as times of the year where there just aren't any plants out producing any nectar, or sometimes we have weather, especially with a lot of cool or wet weather, where the bees are unable to go out and collect the nectar. I remember in 2015 we had a very wet June and July. The bees were unable to go out and collect a lot of the uh, clover flowers, and in fact they were very low on honey. And there were some hives we had to come in and feed them sugar syrup to ensure that they kept raising brood. There are two different ratios to feed the syrup. The one is a thin syrup, which is typically done in the spring and the summer. And this is a 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio. This ratio is very similar to natural occurring nectar that plants produce. It encourages workers to draw out some comb, and it encourages the queen to lay eggs, thinking that there's a strong flow coming in. She'll want to raise a lot more young to kind of ensure the strength of the hive. Oftentimes, if there is a nectar dearth, she will stop laying eggs, or even some worker bees will go back and eat the larvae to ensure that they have enough honey going into the winter. When we hit to the fall season and hives are very light, maybe they didn't collect enough from a fall flow, or the fall flow wasn't strong, and the hives themselves are pretty light, we need to ensure that they do have enough food going into winter. This is the time we'll feed a 2-to-1 sugar to water ratio, and this is called a heavy or a thick syrup. It's a lower moisture content to help the bees to dry it out to 18% moisture to cap it for storage. And this is a feeding that we usually typically start about mid-September into late October if the hives are light. You really want to get this done because once it gets below freezing, they'll stop taking the heavy syrup. Some alternatives to the syrup are going to be ProSweet. This is provided by Mann Lake, and also some high fructose corn syrup is an option. If you want to mix up your own sugar syrup, looking at the ratios, it can be done by either weight or volume. Uh, typical rule of thumb is water weighs a pint a pound the world around. So you will take a 4 pound bag of sugar to 4 pints of water or a half gallon and mix that together for your 1-to-1 sugar syrup. And when you do the heavy 2-to-1 syrup, that'll be 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. For those who want to make their own sugar syrup, you want to use granulated white table sugar. Do not use raw sugar and do not use brown sugar. Those sugars contain a molasses, and that can give the bees digestive issues. The big talk right now is whether or not you want to use sugar from sugar beets or from cane. Chemically, they are the same. Beet sugar does tend to be a little cheaper, so whatever makes you happy, you can use either source. And if you do feed a syrup, this does encourage robbing from neighboring hives, so you want to make sure that you reduce your entrances to prevent robbing from stronger hives. Oftentimes we hit a tough fall, or maybe they can't go out and collect any nectar to get filled up for the year, and they start to run low on food supplies. This happens usually about January or late December. If hives are low on your food, there's a couple options we can make to help them get through winter. An option is to feed them some harder candies or hard sugar. Since there's enough moisture in the hive, these usually soak it up and become soft enough that the bees are able to use it. One popular method is what are called candy boards, and it's a sugar and water mixture where it's pretty much sugar and just enough water to keep it moist, and then you let it harden into a brick, and you place that on a screen with a wood frame around it. It becomes hard, and you place it on top of the brood box, and you cover it up. And the idea is that the condensation from the bees breathing will kind of soften it up, turn it to liquid, and they can utilize it. There is something called a mountain cap method, and you put an empty super on top, lay down a piece of newspaper on the top bars, and you just pour granulated sugar on top of that. This is a quick and easy way to do it as well. It kind of works the same concept. The water from the breathing bees kind of hardens it and turns it into a liquid state that they can use. The downside of this one, I don't like using it, is that it can be kind of messy. There's a product come out within recent years called a winter patty, and these are pre-made patties usually sold by bee suppliers. They are primarily sugar, but they do contain a little bit of protein in them as well. It's not enough protein to get them rearing up with brood, but it does provide enough to give them a well-balanced nutrition. Another product you can use is fondant and hard candy. Fondant is a softer form of that one. Hard candy is going to be the same as what's called a candy board, and these are just pre-made into smaller pieces, and I will show pictures of that onto the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, this is what a candy board will look like here. You have the screen here, and you usually lay down a piece of newspaper on top and pack down the moistened sugar on top and allow it to dry and harden. What's key with these is that you do want to have a ventilation hole here on the front, as well as have a hole here when you make this, so this way the breathing bees can let loose out and ventilate out some of the respiration. This is what the mountain camp method looks like. We have our sheet of newspaper laying down here and the table sugar poured on top of that. These is what I like to make with the hard candy and the candy bricks. I mix it up using a KitchenAid mixer on smaller batches, or I'll take a sugar and just slowly add hot water and mix it up. And what I like to do is I like to place it here into paper plates and let it harden, and then I store them into my freezer. And then if I do come across some hives that will need some, I put on an empty super on top and lay these bricks right on top of that as well. And at the end of the winter into the spring, when the bees don't use this, I'll take these off the top of the hives, and if need be, put them back in the freezer, or I can dissolve them in equal amounts of hot water, and I got a recipe for sugar syrup. So a lot of options to help you get through the winter. As we get to the hamburger and bacon portion of our example with our protein sources, naturally honeybees will want to collect pollen from plants, but not all pollens are created equal. There are 10 essential amino acids that are found in the pollen, and if any of those amino acids are lacking, that's that less amount of pollen that the bees can utilize. Some of the higher quality pollens that are available from plants include clovers, canola, pears, and poplars. Sources that tend to be a little moderate or low in quality are dandelions and asters, and also sunflowers. Commercial beekeepers that pollinate sunflowers oftentimes will have to add pollen substitutes to ensure that they have enough amino acids to continue to raise high quality brood. There has been some work showing that low quality pollen can shorten the life of worker bees in comparison to some of the higher quality, higher well-balanced amino acid pollen sources that allow longer worker bee life. If pollens are lacking, there are some pollen substitutes available, and these come in the forms of pre-made patties or dry powder. You can make your own patties using the dry powder if you mix it with 1-to-1 syrup. Some popular pollen substitutes are AP23 from Dedant, Mega Bee and Ultra Bee, which can be purchased through Mann Lake and other bee suppliers. Sometimes when you want to use the pollen substitutes are when you install packages, since they have no pollen stores for the bees to consume, or also to feed their brood. Oftentimes throughout the year, we will hit pollen dearths, where there's not enough plants to produce pollen. This oftentimes comes in July and August, and sometimes we will have to feed some pollen substitutes during that time period, since that is the time that they are starting to produce winter bees, which are help to survive into the winter. Another good time to use them is during spring buildup. Sometimes pollen stores may be getting low, or oftentimes some of the spring weather makes it difficult to go out and collect, or sometimes there's just not enough high quality pollen available. And sometimes we'll have to feed a pollen substitute to make sure that they are raising some good brood. And last but not least, we surely cannot forget the most important nutrient, which is water. Water is used for a lot of different functions. It's used to dilute the honey when the nurse bees feed that to the brood. It helps thin it out a little bit so it's easier for them to consume. It's also used to cool the hives, especially when it is hot and dry. Bees will gather the water, bring it back to the hive, and then fan it out across the hive. And water has a very good heat holding potential, so as it evaporates and moves through the hive, it gathers the heat and exits out the top of the hive through the ventilation. This kind of helps keeps it cool and prevents the hive from getting too hot. If you are in a drought situation, they do have the tendency to raid bird baths and also your neighbor's pools. So make sure that you set out a water source to try to discourage them from going to your neighbor's pools and bird baths. The best time to do this is in April and May, or even a lot earlier in the season. As they emerge from the hive, getting through the winter, they begin to establish their foraging sources. And if you set out the water source too late, after they've already identified the pool, they will tend to go towards the pool and ignore out the water source that you set out for them. So to kind of wrap it up, going back to our bacon cheeseburger slide, while they may not necessarily eat the bacon and cheeseburger, they do consume carbohydrates, protein, and vitamins, as well as oil and lipids, and we'd probably add a glass of water to this as well to help give them a well-balanced meal. Well, that's all I had for this presentation. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.